Hi, welcome back to Traben's Tomes. On today's episode, we'll be looking at a review for Threads That Bind by Kika Hatzopolou. So before we get into any critique, let me give a short synopsis of what happens in Threads That Bind. The story follows the youngest of three sisters who have all inherited the powers of the Fates. The oldest is able to create new threads, so she's able to connect people to one another or connect them to objects. The middle sister is able to draw out those threads, which the book explains means that she can lessen the pull that those desires have on an individual. And the youngest sister, Io, is what's known as a cutter. She's able to cut threads, so she can cut the connections between people or between a person and an object. She can also cut someone's life thread. So she's considered particularly dangerous in this world. The plot itself is a detective story in which Io takes on a case given to her by a local mob boss. She has to work with the mob boss's second in command, Ide, and she is trying to find out what has happened to these women in her city whose life threads have been cut, but who still remain alive and become wraiths, who use their life threads to attack others. Throughout the story, we meet a wide cast of characters throughout this city, as well as learn about Io's relationship with her sisters and the history of the town. So I'm going to start with three major criticisms of the book, those being the info dumping, the insta-love between Io and Ade, and the fact that Io is not that good of a fictional detective. Starting with the info dumping, this is something that's very easy to do in a book like this because it has to establish a number of rules for this world very quickly. Not only does it have to tell you about the Fateborn and the multiple variations thereof, it also has to establish a good bit of history for this world in order for you to understand the plot. The problem comes in the way that this information is delivered. Oftentimes, characters will be having these conversations and they'll say something like, "Oh, do you think this has something to do with the riots from 5 years ago?" And then we'll have 2 or 3 paragraphs describing these riots. We'll go back to the conversation in progress, and someone else will say, "Oh, maybe we should go look at Montrose Street." And then we'll have a whole thing about Montrose Street and what the police presence is like there and what the buildings look like there. And some of it's important, some of it's relevant, but I found in the beginning it became very distracting and detracting to the main plot going on. It was hard to follow what the characters were doing and the way that they were connecting the points of this mystery when we had to go into these paragraph long descriptions of the history of the city. Now, again, establishing the rules of your fictional world can be difficult, especially if that world diverts from ours in significant ways. In this case, we have a world which has different power users. All their powers work a little bit differently. We get descriptions about what Io sees when she looks through the quilt, which is the way that she visualizes the threads around her. We get viewpoints from other characters who see halos around people's heads and can play them like musical instruments. We have other characters who see red all around them, are able to force that into people's bodies to make them feel different ways. And it's a lot. Sanderson talks about the plateau of your world, right? So the more complicated your world is, the more you have to explain at the beginning to get people up to the point where it's leveled off and everybody understands how the world works. All your readers can follow the story, right? Compare that to a contemporary fantasy in which all you really have to establish is the characters and their connection with one another. That's much shorter of a lead in to get people up to that plateau. So I understand the issue at hand here. I understand why it's difficult for the author to get all that information out and get the reader to a place that they can understand how the world works. However, even taking that into consideration, I felt like the world building here was pretty clunky and it smacked of an author showing their work. In other words, there were details that the author had figured out about their world that they were just so desperate to share, they had to throw it in there along with everything else. And it could have been more finely tuned. It could have been doled out a little bit more piecemeal. and not been as much of a detraction from the story in the early parts of the book. So my second major criticism with the book is the insta-love between Io and Ade. And unfortunately, I feel like fans of the series are going to have an easy out in explaining that because there's a canonical explanation as to why Io and Ade would be a couple. And that is they have a fate thread between the two of them. Now, Io, being able to see the threads, being able to see the quilt, has known about this fate thread from a very young age, and she's agonized over whether she should cut it or what she should do about it. But she's been pretty determined not to meet the person who is on the other end of that thread. Ava, the middle sister, talks about how the thread could be interpreted in a number of ways. Maybe this could be a friend she works with, a partner, it could be a rival, even. It's just something that's fated. But soon after meeting Ade, Io has these internal monologues in which she's swooning over him and talking about how gorgeous he looks and how kind he is. While there is a little bit of an initial pushback, which seems like what she would do given her history, it quickly becomes another distracting element from the plot. So now we have not only the info dumping from the author, but we have these paragraphs where Io is swooning over a person that she's only met a few days before. There are some interesting ethical issues brought up later in the book as far as should Io tell Ade about the fate thread, because Ade is very much resistant to the idea of fate and about predestination and other people controlling him. But ultimately, this was an element that I feel mostly served to have a romance plot put into this book alongside the detective story. My final major issue with the book is that Io is not a good fictional detective, or at least the way she goes about doing her detective work should have resulted in more dire consequences. Several times in this book, Io feels like she has cracked this case wide open and she immediately goes to confront the people that she thinks is responsible. On at least 3 separate occasions, she accuses the wrong person of being the mastermind behind the plot. Now, this could have been used as a way to show her impulsiveness and give her consequences for taking those actions. But with few exceptions, Io jumps right back into the investigation. She's not impeded that much, even though she accuses high profile individuals of being the masterminds behind this plot. She's never arrested. She's never taken out of action. I feel like the briefest that she pauses in the investigation is when she sleeps overnight in a homeless shelter. Felt this character trait really didn't work for the character because there weren't any serious repercussions for these actions. Let's talk about some things that the book did well. So to start with, eventually the info dumping and the insta-love paragraphs of her swooning over Ide take a back seat. The last 100 pages or so of this book, that has mostly wrapped up, and we are able to just enjoy the ride of the detective story. If you look at titles like Stormfront or Full Moon, the first few entries in the Dresden Files series, they had similar problems with pacing, with characterization, with repeated plots. And so I have confidence that given that we did a lot of the growing pains of establishing this world in the first book, a sequel story could be much stronger than what was presented here. I also really loved the relationship between Io and her 2 older sisters, Ava and Thais. The 3 of them are unique, and their relationships to one another are not carbon copies of each other. It really feels like we have 3 fleshed out characters, and they each have their own separate motivations and their own separate reactions to the things that are happening around them. The fallout between the differences the sisters have form the emotional core of the story, and I think is one of its strongest elements. I also feel that in general, the world that's developed here is very interesting. I like the idea of these Fate-born, these characters that have the powers of gods, and the way that they're developed, the way that that power is developed is very interesting. It's just bogged down by a story that struggles to integrate that information smoothly into the plot. The final few revelations in this book were very interesting. I felt like the final reveal, while you could probably figure it out fairly early on, is nonetheless very striking and a very interesting twist to the story. I would pick up a sequel to Threads That Bind because I feel like it has a lot of potential, but because of the reasons I've mentioned earlier, this is going to get a 3 out of 5 from me. I feel like the beginning part of the book was really muddled. I am probably not going to remember all the details of the world and the ways that the different Fateborn's powers work. I will remember the end of the story. I will remember the Aura sisters' relationships with one another. I hope a sequel sees some more restrained world building, toned down relationship between Io and Ade, or at least one which is dealt with a little bit more maturely than what was seen here. Again, I don't feel like this was a weak story, and I don't feel like it was a bad story. I just feel like it's lacking a little bit of polish to get that 4 or 5 star rating. With a little bit of polish, a sequel to this book could see it becoming one of my favorites. Unfortunately, for now, it's just not there. But now I'd like to hear from you. Is this a title that you're interested in? Have you already read it? What were your thoughts? Sound off in the comments below. If you are looking for other urban fantasy reads, you might check out J. Wells' Dirty Magic, the first book in the Prospero War series. This is a much more mature take on the idea of a drug war that is fueled by magic. Or you could check out the poster child for urban fantasy, Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series. The first one in that line is Stormfront. This is currently up to a 17-book series, if I'm not mistaken. This is Traven reminding you that perception is reality. If you enjoyed Threads That Bind, if you felt like it was 5 stars, then it was 5 stars for you, and I'm happy you enjoyed it. I just wanted to get my thoughts out on this book and give people an idea of what to expect if they're planning on picking it up. Let me know if you found this review helpful and if there's anything you'd like me to take a look at in the future. Have a good day.